It shook the country and resonated around the world. 3 years later, a look at the impact of the January 6th riot at the U.S. Capitol. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidoo, and this is The Heat. The United States Supreme Court said Friday it will review the Colorado Supreme Court's unprecedented decision removing former President Donald Trump from that state's ballot. We'll have more on that later in the program. But we begin with the anniversary of the January 6th riot at the U.S. Capitol. President Joe Biden told voters on Friday that his potential election opponent, Donald Trump, is a threat to democracy. Trump was impeached for allegedly inciting the mob that stormed Congress to stop Biden succeeding him. Owen Fairclough reports.
It was an insurrection that shook the world and for many defined his divisive presidency.
We fight like hell.
Donald Trump was impeached but acquitted for allegedly inciting his supporters to stop Congress from certifying Joe Biden's election victory by any means.
232 votes.
The scenes I witnessed that day were also watched by people around the world as what was described as an attempted coup d'etat unfolded live on video.
We've seen tear gas being fired repeatedly.
But it also happened in an era of disinformation fueled by social media and compounded by Trump's repeated denials that he was in any way responsible for what happened, plus his unfounded claims that the election was rigged against him. And all of that is driving two competing narratives in an already extraordinary presidential election campaign.
I believe in free and fair elections.
Biden is framing his opponent as an existential threat to the United States.
There's something dangerous happening in America. There's an extremist movement that does not share the basic beliefs in our democracy.
The president marked the third anniversary of January the 6th near Philadelphia, at the spot where, in 1777, George Washington rallied his demoralized troops to fight and overthrow British rule, a defining moment in U.S. history. But Trump is framing Biden in similar terms while lauding January the 6th rioters as heroes and patriots.
Joe Biden is a threat to democracy. I will save democracy. The threat is crooked Joe Biden. He's an enemy of the state.
But the ramifications of January the 6th are starting to hit Trump as he tries to win back the White House in November.
As the presidential election cycle accelerates, Trump is facing multiple criminal and civil trials this year, including one relating to his actions on January the 6th. And on top of that, 2 states have disqualified Trump from the Republican ballot, while dozens of other states have similar challenges pending. So it's likely that the Supreme Court will have to weigh in on the critical question of whether Trump can even run as a candidate. As Trump returned to Iowa on Friday ahead of the voter caucus that traditionally signals the start of the presidential campaign in earnest, his strategy appears to be resonating. Some of the latest polling suggests that Republicans who once blamed him for January the 6th and splintering the party are now sympathetic to him.
Trump won!
While Biden's approval ratings are dropping. Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Washington.
There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Douglas Sloan is a political analyst and principal at the National Capital Strategy Group. Gene Rossi is a former assistant U.S. attorney. He spent nearly 3 decades with the Justice Department. Also with us is Adolfo Franco. He's an attorney and Republican strategist. And Frank Sesno served as CNN's Washington bureau chief. He's currently the executive director of George Washington University's Alliance for a Sustainable Future. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Frank, it's been 3 years since rioters stormed the U.S. Capitol. There was a joint session of Congress meeting at that time to certify the election. In these past 3 years, what have we learned? Has this been resolved in any way, or is it a wound that just continues to fester?
It's a wound that continues to fester and maybe is opening wider. It has not been resolved. In fact, if anything, these court cases have allowed Donald Trump to amplify his narrative that he is being politically persecuted, that the campaign that drove him from office is now working to keep him from running again and returning to office, and that resonates with his base, but it resonates with more than his base. As was pointed out in the piece just a moment ago, if you look at head-to-head polls, hypothetical polls between Donald Trump and Joe Biden today, it's neck and neck if Donald Trump isn't even up by a point or two. So that goes well beyond the Donald Trump base. So what's happened in the past 3 years? This has been litigated over and over again. There has been no evidence presented of any significant campaign to steal the election from Donald Trump, but that narrative continues to thrive in his camp. He's got 91 indictments against him, but that the legal process does not even remotely look like it has mortally wounded him. And Joe Biden, as was also pointed out, has weakened in the polls. That's partly because of perceptions that he's too old. Partly a lot of what he's done has been very controversial. But this question, this fight over democracy has not been a neat and tidy one, and it has not seemed to tick this race one way or the other. This is a festering wound, as you point out.
Frank, as you point out, Trump's support has widened. It's expanded. It's gone beyond the base. There are now others who support him as well, and as you've just pointed out as well, here is a man who's facing 91 felony counts, and he remains the leading Republican candidate for the nomination. How does one explain this?
It's a very interesting and difficult question. I think it's explained on many levels. First of all, I think his narrative has been very persuasive. It's very clear. He is very dogmatic and assertive when he presents it. He apologizes for nothing. The Joe Biden weakness is real. He does not have a base. This is a very significant thing that the incumbent faces. The reality is that, Obama had a base, Reagan had a base, Clinton had a base, Trump had a base. Biden doesn't really have a strong base. And there's been a lot of displacement because of coming out of the COVID pandemic. The irony here is that in many ways, it's 2024. Think back 40 years to 1984. We came out of a very severe recession, high inflation. Ronald Reagan was able to say it's morning in America. In many ways, a lot of the economic numbers line up, and you should be able to make a case that it's kind of morning in America. We've avoided a recession. Inflation is coming down, but that simply is not resonating. One of the reasons is the polarization of the country, the gerrymandered districts that have driven our politics to the corners, and media in many cases that have ratified, validated this kind of polarization, making it very difficult to find a middle ground.
Adolfo, great to have you with us in the studio. The former president faces criminal charges, as we've just heard, in federal and state courts for allegedly attempting to subvert the outcome of the 2020 election. Now, he's not been charged with any crimes relating to fomenting an insurrection or a rebellion on January 6th. We've seen him at many campaign events over the past few weeks and months. This really comes up. Are the events of January 6th really a non-event, not just for Republican voters, but it seems for independents as well?
Well, I don't think it's a non-event. I just think it's the opposite. I think the American people, I disagree with some of the things that Frank has just said and agree with some of them. First of all, it's nightmare in America for anybody that's buying gasoline or food or so forth. I don't care what the macro numbers supposedly say after you run inflation to 40-year highs, and then you bring it down a little bit and you say we have a victory. The metric should be where you were 4 years ago. And when you look at that, this administration has been a disaster. But back to January 6th, obviously the problem here has been a president, the current president, who ran as a uniter. Remember this? Remember he was to unify the country? He's done everything but that. I disagree that it's President Trump. It's the Democrats that have created, first of all, with their sham, partisan House investigation. The Department of Justice looked at all this and concluded there was, quote unquote, no insurrection. And you're correct. There have never been any charges or anything of the kind. And yet this is continually pounded by the Democrats to continue to divide the country. When you have more than half of the country supporting President Trump, and you have a president going out to Valley Forge and throwing gasoline and accusing Republicans of being extremists and against democracy, is just not resonating. What's resonating is a sense of fairness. and that is they see a weaponization of the process. They're doing everything possible. I know we'll get to a discussion later to keep President Trump off the ballot.
Yeah.
They're manipulating the system to try to, you mentioned 91 counts, all kinds of counts, frivolous things in New York that are no longer even being covered by the press. So when the American people sit back and look at this, you have to remember, the Syracuse poll showed that 3.4% of journalists and media identify as Republican, meaning most of the people in your profession are on the left, and your programs are on the left, and the media is on the left. Despite that, the American people are not there. They're seeing the sense of fairness. They're seeing this as a persecution. Your report was correct. This was a riot. What you didn't run in this clip was a part where President Trump said, let's march to the Capitol peacefully. Peacefully. President Trump, a coup d'etat involves tanks, the military, and the rest of it. Yeah. So when people sit back, they see a crowd that was behaving inappropriately, that was a riot, and trying to turn it into an insurrection that the president was sitting trying to overthrow the government. That's why this is not working. But the last point is, this is the last card they have, because Frank is right. He has no base. He has no support for his policies. So if you're not going to attack President Trump on this, you have no basis upon which to do so.
All right. Douglas Sloan, one of the other candidates for the Republican nomination is Ron DeSantis. He appeared on a town hall, which was hosted by the cable network CNN, and this was his view on the election. Let's listen to him.
The Democrats want Trump to be the candidate. They are going to talk about all the legal stuff, January 6th. That will be what the election will be about. You don't want it to be a referendum on Trump and the past. You want it to be a referendum on Biden's failures, on our positive vision for this country.
So, Douglas, does Ron DeSantis have a point there?
To an extent, he does. Make no mistake that Trump is the preferred candidate for Biden and the Democratic Party. He is the candidate that has the most failings in terms of what happened with January 6th, in terms of how he poorly handled COVID, in terms of it's his words. He's paraphrasing Hitler. He says the immigrant blood is poisoning America, that he's going to be a dictator on day one, that he would completely pull support from Ukraine and all these different things. So, yeah, Trump gives, that's a very target-rich environment where we're talking about former President Trump, who's been indicted, who's facing 91 charges different charges in 4 different courts and 91 different indictments. So he really is someone that the Democrats would prefer. And that makes for a great argument. However, Ron DeSantis isn't exactly someone that is clean with no dirt on his suit. If you look at Florida and you look at the state of living in the state of Florida, with all the problems he's had with Disney, with high unemployment, with the violence in Florida, with the craziness, you just have to Google a man from Florida or a woman in Florida and something crazy comes up. So that's also someone that has that would be a target-rich environment or a target-rich candidate for Democrats.
Right.
But absolutely, Trump is the candidate that Democrats would like to see in the fall, especially when he's facing all these indictments. And some of this stuff looks like he may be criminally charged after he wins the Republican nomination, which would create quite the conundrum for the RNC.
Okay, Gene Rossi, if we listen to the political rhetoric, especially from Democrats over the past few months, over the past few years recently, we often hear January 6th and Donald Trump in the same sentence. So the question is, why didn't the special counsel, Jack Smith, charge Donald Trump with any crimes relating to fomenting an insurrection or a rebellion?
Because Gene Rossi wasn't the prosecutor. I worked for the Department of Justice for almost 30 years. I had a 6-week trial, February, March of this year. I represented the first oath keeper to go into the Capitol. I lost, but I can tell you this right now. If this trial's held, the January 6th trial's held in either March, April, or May, or even in August, the evidence against Donald Trump, based on my review of the evidence against my client, who was an oath keeper, the evidence is overwhelming. When Donald Trump gave that speech in front of 15,000 people, not 100 that he said, and he used the word fight 20 times, and he threw in peacefully once, maybe twice, my client and others got the impression, go to that Capitol. You have a mission. And there was violence intended. There were firearms that were brought to Arlington. They were ready for a coup. So anybody who says it's a bunch of tourists or is peaceful or they didn't intend to cause havoc, they are wrong based on my discovery and presentation and experience in the case. Here's the mistake that Jack Smith made, and Adolfo kind of hit on it. You all hit on it. He should have charged insurrection. If you look at the statute and in viewing the evidence in the light most unfavorable to Mr. Trump, he meets every category of insurrection and aiding and abetting. And that's the only thing I can say is that somebody else should have prosecuted him and indicted him for that. I want to add one more thing. Polls show that if he is convicted of serious crimes, not the Alvin Bragg thing, the Stormy Daniels, that's not a serious indictment. But if he's convicted of serious crimes, all those poll numbers that show Donald Trump near 50% against Biden, it's going to go down. It will go down.
Briefly, Adolfo, your response.
Briefly. Well, nice to see you, Gene. I see it completely differently, my friend. First of all, he wasn't charged with insurrection. That's the first thing.
I agree.
Number one, which is you're being a lawyer. Number two, how many politicians have used the word fight and fight like heck and we're going to fight and the fiery speeches? I can show you reels and reels of politicians that are saying the same thing. The key is this. What was his state of mind? What was the president intending to do? And intent, as you as a good lawyer that you are, what was the president's intent? And it's very clear to me that was not his intent. That, of course, is not up to you or me. That would be up to a jury or that would be up to a judge to decide. And that is what is failing here, and it's key. Lastly, on this thing on polls, how many times have we heard, starting with Alvin Bragg on this network, that it's the beginning of the end? The country, there are millions, tens of millions of people that remain extremely loyal to President Trump, and that is not going to change.
All right, I want to move on to Frank. Frank, let's talk about that announcement from the United States Supreme Court late on Friday. The court has agreed now to hear oral arguments on whether President Trump can be disqualified from appearing on Colorado's ballot. That's on the primary ballot. And this sets up a case, of course. That announcement from the U.S. Supreme Court, did that come to you as any kind of surprise?
No. I think the timing has been a question, but I've expected the Supreme Court to rule on this. And frankly, I expect the Supreme Court to toss out the Colorado decision, which barred Trump from the ballot there. And not just because there are the majority of the justices who are conservative, but there's enough debate and question on this. And my expectation, I could be wrong. I've been wrong about everything else, so this shouldn't be any different necessarily. But I think the court is going to say, there has been no procedure. There's been no jury trial or verdict that determines that has given the former president, due process here, and so it's the Colorado Supreme Court that has declared that he is guilty of insurrection and therefore barred from the ballot. I would just be very surprised if this stands, and I think that in many ways, this is an important decision for the Supreme Court to reach, because if it rules otherwise, we're going to get a bizarre patchwork across the country, and then the former president's case narrative that he is being persecuted, that he is being kept from the ballot, is really going to resonate. The one thing that he says and his allies say that really should resonate with most everyone is the most important court here is the court of public opinion, and that's the ballot box. So it's going to be a very interesting thing to see this played out, to see this argued, to see what the justices say. The Colorado Supreme Court, which ruled that he should not be on the ballot there, was actually a thoughtful opinion. Whether you agree with it or not, it was argued cleanly and clearly. But I think that we're coming very rapidly to a critical decision point here. As I say, I expect the Supreme Court to say, put him on the ballot.
Jean Rossi, what is your view on this? The Supreme Court invoked the 14th Amendment, which disqualifies a candidate on the basis that that candidate may have engaged in insurrection. I mean, explain this to us. Does the candidate actually have to be found guilty of insurrection for that to take effect? Or can the court just decide without any verdict?
Well, the answer is he does not have to be found guilty. And there are basically three camps on this issue. On one side, you have Michael Ludwig, one of the most conservative judges that the federal court system has ever had. You have the Federalist Society, and you have, another a strange bedfellow, Lawrence Tribe, saying that it's very clear that you don't have to be convicted. If there's evidence of insurrection, they cannot be on a ballot or be elected. But on the other side, which has a good point, this is a political question. It's non-justiciable, as they say, and that it's up to Congress at the end. If President Trump is reelected, it's up to Congress to keep him out. So in the middle, you'll probably have the Supreme Court. My prediction is sort of like what Frank just said. I think the Supreme Court is going to pass this like a hot potato, and they're probably going to find a technical way to get out of it without establishing precedent and saying that President Trump did not have enough due process at the Colorado level.
Go ahead.
Well, this is just a ludicrous waste of time for the American people, both legally and politically. First, on the legal side, I question whether the 14th Amendment, that was a Civil War amendment, has anything to do with the current so-called insurrection. Secondly, Gene, as you know, in the first 2 or 3 drafts of that amendment, the word president was initially included and then was omitted. So therefore, an officer of the United States, now you can argue he's an officer, but everywhere else, the president is identified in the Constitution as the president. And in the earlier drafts, it was eliminated. And Section 3 requires a statute and so forth. Legally, this is totally unfounded. Let me clarify something about the Colorado Supreme Court. That is an elected Supreme Court, usually a mistake in my opinion. So these are all politicians in that court. That decision was 4-3. 4 Democrats and 3 Republicans. If that doesn't tell you it's political, I don't know what does. You didn't mention the main political operative, Secretary of State, who is not a lawyer, who's saying she made her own decision on her own, who was at the White House in a fundraiser for President Trump. Now, if you're so worried about democracy and perceptions of democracy, and our democratic system is at play, here's a perfect example again of the manipulation of the system. Politically, I agree with the other guest on here, it is suicide. But don't take my word for it. David Axelrod, Obama's campaign manager, said it would tear the country apart. Eric Newsom is against it. Maine's Senator King is against this. So even Democrats realize this is a political suicide. The Supreme Court will decide this correctly.
All right, Douglas Sloan, was this a blunder by the Colorado Supreme Court, which, as Adolfo just pointed out, is dominated by Democrats, or by the Secretary of State in Maine? Because as Frank mentioned a moment ago, if this continues across the country, then Trump is going to say, look, I'm being victimized here. And it could work in his favor.
Yeah, and just before I address that, I misspoke earlier. It's 91 felony charges under 4 indictments. I switched that around. My apologies. I don't know if I would necessarily say that they erred. It seems to be a pretty straightforward matter of constitutional law and strict constructionist interpretation of the 14th Amendment, Section 3, regarding an insurrectionist. The question needs to be discussed. They need to bring this before the courts, because there is obviously a very real question out there. Many people do see former President Trump as an insurrectionist and having led an insurrection against this country. So this is something that needs to be resolved. So I'm not going to say that they erred in bringing this forward. But I'm looking forward to the Supreme Court discussing it, litigating it, and making a decision. I do not feel it will be a partisan decision, because they've rejected Trump before. I think Trump tried to invoke executive privilege against the January 6th committee, and they threw that out. So I don't feel that this will be a partisan decision.
I want to stay with you for the next question, Douglas, and this is about the Republican campaign. The Republican candidate, Nikki Haley, was asked at one of the campaign events what she thought were the reasons behind the U.S. Civil War. This was her response. Let's listen.
I mean, I think the cause of the Civil War was basically how government was going to run, the freedoms and what people could and couldn't do.
Thank you. And in the year 2023, it's astonishing to me that you answer that question without mentioning the word slavery.
What do you want me to say about slavery?
No, you've answered my question. Thank you.
Next question.
So here's the thing, Douglas. She did subsequently walk back those comments. But if we look at African-American black support for President Biden, it's going down. It's down from 87% to 63%, according to a Roper poll.
Yeah, you know, I heard Adolfo earlier talking about the polls, and I wouldn't read too much into polls at this stage. For those of us that are early or old enough to remember, we can all recall that the polls had Romney beating Obama back in 2012. For a more recent example, many of the polls saw a red wave in 2022, as Adolfo was well to remember, and I predicted that it wouldn't be a red wave, but all the pollsters said, oh, it's going to be a red wave, they're going to lose the Senate, they're going to completely take over the House and everything, and none of that happened. So you really have to take a lot of polls with a grain of salt and really look at some of the outside factors that really weigh into how people vote and how people feel about different candidates. I wouldn't necessarily put much faith into Biden losing the black vote. That's not going to happen because black people are not going to vote for Trump no matter what the polls say. And obviously, Nikki Haley made a huge error in not attributing the Civil War to slavery. When the vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, said in his cornerstone speech that the states were seceding from the Union because of slavery. So obviously that was a huge blunder.
All right, Frank, I want to get to one other issue. We've got less than a minute, unfortunately, but that is the issue of immigration. We're hearing more about that right now, and it actually is tied up to more funding for Israel and for the Ukraine. The Republicans say, look, there's got to be immigration reform before we agree on more funding. How big an issue is this?
I think it is the issue. I actually think as much as the Democrats are going to try to make democracy the issue and Trump is going to try to make stealing the election in 2020 the issue or whatever it's going to be, the issue that is galvanizing, polarizing this country right now, and if you look at the numbers at the borders and what's happening in the cities, immigration is the issue. Republicans are making a big issue out of it, and they're getting traction on it. The Democrats don't know quite how to respond to this. If this were a less political time, you would actually see the president of one party and the governor of the other in Texas together on the border saying, we need to work together to address this. Instead, it's just another wedge issue. This could be a fatal wedge issue because it is enormous. It is bankrupting New York City, Denver, go across the country now, as well as the states that are on the border itself. So this may be this year's third rail of politics.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.